Helen Clay Frick, the Steel Empire heiress, lived a life marked by heartbreak, privilege and passion. She was fiercely independent and often at odds with society. Despite this, she dedicated her life to art, philanthropy, and preserving her family's legacy, often from the shadows. So join me as we discover the secrets of Helen Frick's forgotten life. Helen Clay Frick was born on the 2nd of September 1888 in the city of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania in the United States. Her father was Henry Clay Frick, the chairman of the Carnegie Steel Company, one of the most important businesses in America and the world at the time. Frick had founded the company with Andrew Carnegie, the Scottish-born American industrialist who led the immense growth of the American economy in the second half of the 19th century, along with other figures like Cornelius Vanderbilt and John Rockefeller. From amongst these leading industrialists of the Gilded Age in the US, Frick was probably the most controversial on account of his reputation as a strikebreaker and anti-union campaigner. The most infamous moment in this came in 1892, when Helen was 3 years old, and her father violently suppressed the Homestead strike near Pittsburgh, during which 10 people were killed and dozens were injured. Helen's mother was Adelaide Howard Childs. She and Henry married in 1881. Their union resulted in 4 children: a boy, Charles Frick, in 1883, Martha Howard in 1885, Helen in 1888, and Henry in 1892. The family life was extravagant, living between mansions in Pittsburgh in Massachusetts and later in Manhattan, but it was also troubled in some respects. Helen's older sister Martha was a sickly child, and her illness formed some of Helen's earliest family memories. Henry obtained the best doctors in the country to try and cure her, but nothing helped. Apparently, when Martha was 2 years old, she swallowed a pin during a family trip to Europe. Many attribute this as the source of her excruciatingly painful illness, which led to her death in 1891 at just 5 years of age. The following year, Helen's baby brother, Henry Jr., died at just 3 weeks old in 1892, in the middle of the Homestead strike. Thus, Helen would grow up with just one sibling, her older brother Childs. As one would expect, her parents were devastated by the loss of their children, and her mother in particular fell into a depression. As a result, Helen was raised in a household consumed by obsessive mourning. To make matters worse, there was also an assassination attempt on Henry on the 23rd of July 1892, when one Alexander Berkman burst into his office. Berkman then pointed his revolver at Frick's head and managed to fire 2 shots before being tackled to the ground. Berkman wasn't completely subdued though, and managed to stab Henry a few times before more employees came to pin him down. Frick narrowly escaped death, suffering severe injuries that miraculously spared any vital organs. Defying the odds, he made an astonishing recovery and was back at his desk within a week. Helen's early life was not overly rooted in one place. Though born in Pittsburgh and raised there in her early years, her father had a huge mansion in Massachusetts, and in 1905 began renting a very large house on the Upper East Side of Manhattan as well. The family increasingly based themselves out of this home, in part because the business alliance between Frick and Carnegie became frayed in the 1890s, and Helen's father had begun moving his operations to New York. Although this move was beneficial for Henry, and they now lived in the spectacular Vanderbilt Triple Palace, Helen wasn't happy with the change. She considered Pittsburgh to be her home, and it was the place she loved. It was also at this time that she began attending the revered Spence School, an all-girls private school in New York City. In 1908, Helen dazzled Pittsburgh society with her debut, but instead of accepting a lavish jewellery gift, she made a bold and selfless statement. She persuaded her father to donate an astonishing 150 acres to the city, transforming it into a park. This land donation would become the city's largest park, known today as Frick Park. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Americans were infatuated with all things European, from aristocratic titles to the allure of old world culture. Wealthy industrialists eagerly sent their daughters across the Atlantic to marry into European nobility, or to visit countries with rich cultures and heritage like England, France, Germany, Spain and Italy. Helen was no different. As a teenager in the early 1900s, she visited Europe on an all but annual basis. It was here, as she wandered the halls of the Louvre Museum in Paris, the National Gallery in London, the Museo del Prado in Madrid, and the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, that her love of art, and in particular the culture of the Renaissance and early modern Europe, was born. These experiences ignited a lifelong passion and planted the seeds of a philanthropic vision that would shape her legacy for generations to come. Helen spent much of the First World War between 1914 and 1918 in Europe, working as a volunteer and charitable aid promoter. This was in line with her earlier efforts in the US. Back in 1910, when she was just 21 years of age, she had founded the Iron Rail Vacation Home for Working Girls in the town of Wenham in Massachusetts, a charity helping poor female textile workers in the state. Now in 1917, she established a hospital unit in France in association with the Red Cross, following the entry of the United States into the war, using her considerable trust money to finance it. She left for France with several associates, and over the next year engaged in a wide range of work, which included sending Christmas gifts to soldiers on the Western Front and petitioning her father to finance an orphanage for the children of individuals who had lost their lives in the war in France. Helen's years in France were marked by heartbreak, as the one great love of her life slipped away. In 1913, back in the United States, Fordyce St. John, a promising young surgeon, began courting her. Friends and acquaintances spoke of their deep affection for one another, and many believed a proposal was imminent before St. John was called to Europe as World War I erupted. But the proposal never came. The reasons remain shrouded in mystery, though historians suggest Helen's brother may have intervened, warning St. John that their father would never approve of the match. While serving on the front lines in Flanders, St. John became a war hero, earning the Distinguished Service Cross for his bravery. Yet, the distance proved insurmountable, and their love story quickly ended. St. John returned home to marry another, Jane Rignall, and became an esteemed surgeon. Helen, however, never married or had children. Helen's marital status became a lightning rod for intrigue and speculation after her life took a dramatic turn on the 2nd of December 1919. That day, her father passed away at 69 years of age, leaving not only an immense fortune, but also an enormous responsibility. Devoted to her father's memory and sharing his passion for art and philanthropy, Helen was thrust into the spotlight as the steward of his legacy. Her inheritance was staggering: $5 million in cash immediately, and over $30 million more in land, business shares and assets, a fortune equivalent to over $1 billion today, if not more. Overnight, Helen became the wealthiest unmarried woman in America, a title that made her the focus of endless fascination and scrutiny. But this financial windfall came at a cost. Her father's blatant favoritism left her older brother, Charles Frick, with a comparatively modest inheritance, igniting bitter disputes that shattered their bond. This estrangement was a devastating blow, compounded by her strained relationship with her mother, Adelaide, whose mental state continued to go downhill after her husband's death. Adelaide's passive demeanour and growing detachment left Helen isolated in her new role as head of the family's vast empire. In a bid to heal the wounds caused by her father's unequal will, Helen later tried to make amends. When Adelaide died in 1931, Helen selflessly bequeathed her share of their mother's estate to Charles. Yet, the damage had already been done, and the shadows of familial discord lingered over the rest of her life. One of the provisions of Helen's father's will was that his enormous and extremely valuable art collection should be made available in some way to the public. Over several decades, Henry Clay Frick had acquired some of the most iconic paintings produced in Europe during the Renaissance, the Dutch Golden Age, and the Baroque Enlightenment and Romantic eras. This included many famous portraits by renowned artists, and it was one of the most significant art collections ever assembled in private hands. Helen quickly followed through on her father's wishes. In 1920, she incorporated the Frick collection in Manhattan in her father's mansion on the Upper East Side, and after many years of careful planning and curating, the collection was made accessible to the public in 1935. She became one of the 9 original trustees of the board of the charity that oversaw operations, while she also expended some of her personal estate expanding the collection, acquiring works by the likes of Goya, Monet, and Piero della Francesca. Years later, once she retired from the board and day-to-day management of the museum, Helen Frick donated sculptures and other physical objects of cultural and historical significance to the collection, ones which expanded it beyond being a collection of paintings. Helen also played a role in developing the Frick collection into an archive and reference department. For instance, she financed the creation of the Frick Art Reference Library as a wing of the Frick Collections, one of New York's great libraries for the study of fine art. This was opened in 1924 and was clearly a project close to her heart, as she would serve as its director for nearly 6 decades, only finally stepping down in 1983. She could be a fussy overseer. For many years, men weren't allowed in if they were not wearing a jacket and tie. Yet, the library became one of the world's greatest art libraries, and today houses 150,000 books, nearly 500,000 photographs, and approximately 50,000 catalogues of sales of art collections. While the management of the Frick collection and the opening of it to the public was Helen's greatest act of philanthropy, she engaged in many other charitable endeavors. For instance, in the 1950s, she donated the majority of a large estate that she'd inherited in Westchester County in New York in order to create the Westmoreland Sanctuary. Today it functions as a publicly accessible nature reserve, popular for hiking, with summer camps and a restored 19th century church that acts as a nature center. At home in Pittsburgh, she worked with the University of Pittsburgh to fund the creation of a Department of Fine Art, where courses were taught on European art. She also established a separate museum in her hometown, the Frick Art Museum. What marked this as distinctive from the Frick collection in New York is that the Pittsburgh institution houses paintings acquired by Helen herself rather than her father, notably works by Claude Monet and Peter Paul Rubens. As noted, Helen did not marry, nor did she have any children. Instead, she dedicated herself to her passions and to giving back. This continued throughout her whole life, and she even financed a fine arts building at the University of Pittsburgh. Yet her relationship with the university would later break when they started to employ Germans. Well, Helen had developed a lifelong prejudice against German people following her experiences in France during the First World War. Helen's financing of this building and other institutions were increasingly done in a secretive manner from the 1940s onwards, a sign of her humble nature and the quiet approach she took to her charitable work. This was reflected in her private life. As she aged, Helen was rarely seen in public, only occasionally attending major social events in New York, and instead spending most of her time back in her native Pittsburgh, where she lived at Clayton Manor. Her life might appear reclusive to some, particularly because she didn't seek social limelight or public recognition, but it probably goes too far to suggest that she was a recluse. Helen Frick was simply an elderly woman who preferred a private existence, away from the prying eyes of New York. She also developed an intense dislike of modernist art, and had little reason as a result to attend exhibitions and events in New York that celebrated work that she disliked. Helen Frick eventually died in Pittsburgh on the 9th of November 1984 at 96 years of age. Because she had no children herself, her estate, which was considerably reduced owing to her charitable efforts, but still extremely large, passed to a substantial degree to her nieces and nephews, and to the grandchildren of her brother Charles. Helen's enduring legacy is a Frick collection in New York, which is visited by over 300,000 people every year, and is one of New York's hidden gems. The Frick Pittsburgh is a collection of museums centered on Clayton and the Frick Art Museum, most of which celebrate Helen's philanthropy, and which themselves draw over 100,000 visitors a year. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Helen Clay Frick. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments, and if you have any suggestions, also let me know down below in the comments. I hope everyone had a very Merry Christmas, and I wish all of you a Happy New Year. Also, I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life in 2025. Thanks.